We start this week with this week's terror attacks in France, Europe's most horrific attack since 2011, when Anders Breivik, the Freemason guy who was assassin over in Norway, he killed 77 young socialists at a summer camp in Norway. Wednesday's massacre of 12 people at the offices of Charlie Hebdo magazine, plus a follow-up attack near a metro station, and today these two sieges which have now come to an end, one at an industrial estate and one at a Paris supermarket. So what do you make of all this, Martin?
Well, the obvious point to make in the first place is that these guys, if they are, the point is that we don't know who these guys are. We don't know what really happened. So we probably never will know all the detail. But people shouldn't presume that the obvious is necessarily what's going on here. NATO itself has a track record of engaging in provocational terrorism through its Gladio networks.
Well, what do you mean by provocational terrorism?
Well, in other words, things taking place which are designed to scare the public, lead to more powers for the security forces, close off political options, whatever. So the bombing of Bologna railway station in 1980, according to the best investigations of the Italian police force, was carried out by agents of NATO. So that's not. I'm not saying that agents of NATO have carried out this attack. We don't know. But in the past, they certainly have. What we do know is if the people who did this attack are the ones that have been named by the French police, and of course we don't know that, they found a identity document of one of them in the getaway car. Now this starts to ring alarm bells for me. If you're a commando style attacker, would you leave your identity document? Would you even take your identity document with you? And certainly, why would you leave it in the getaway car? So these kind of questions immediately emerge. Various people have looked at the videos of what went on and said, well, these guys have had military training. Now, if they are the guys that the French have fingered, then they have been fighting in Syria against the government of Bashar al-Assad. And we know for a fact, and I don't think there's any dispute about this, that French, British and US special forces have been training exactly these kind of people to do exactly this kind of attack. If this attack had been carried out in Damascus against a pro-Assad publication, that would be regarded as a legitimate political and military act. Because it's taken place in Paris, I mean, don't forget how many people have died in Syria in the last 3 and 4 years. And as we said in the first hour of the show, Roland Dumas, the French foreign minister, has said that he was approached at an international meeting.
As I keep trying to correct you on this, a party in London he was at.
But he has said that he was approached by officials, British officials.
They were British officials, yeah.
Yeah, we are going to run an armed uprising in Syria. Now, I don't think there will be any doubt in the history books that the armed uprisings in both Libya and Syria have been fomented by the Western security services. Now, that means that they must have armed and trained those who are engaged in these actions in Syria and Libya. Now, at the very least you could say is that's a very silly thing to do, because then these people are armed, trained, and they may just come back and do it to you, which is the general story we're told about Al-Qaeda anyway. Al-Qaeda was definitely set up by the Western security services in the 1980s, with Britain in the lead role in Operation Cyclone. So in other words, many of these jihadis have been trained by NATO special forces. But what about Turkey, by Jordan, by Britain?
What about the contacts? They're not by the French necessarily, because the French have always been a little bit peripheral to NATO. In fact, Charles de Gaulle famously left NATO, didn't he, in 1966?
Yes, he did.
And actually, they only rejoined NATO under Sarkozy in 2009.
Indeed. So, in other words, now, if they get attacked by NATO let's just say, let's follow through the logic of what you're saying. If this was a provocation by NATO, it's in order to force France into line over Syria, over Russia, over various other things.
Now that's interesting, because back in October there was an attack on the Canadian Parliament building in Ottawa, and in December in Sydney, just at the times when those two governments were both looking at whether or not they were going to support the international coalition against ISIS.
Indeed, and don't forget that until, I mean, it really deserves to be stressed to people that until a year ago, we were backing ISIS and other groups in Syria who were fighting the regime of Bashar al-Assad.
Well, apparently ISIS, hang on, because ISIS didn't exist then.
No, but the people who are in ISIS already existed. They've been coming from all over the world, and there's no doubt about it that in Turkey and Jordan, jihadis have been coming from all over the world, many from Libya, Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who was the head of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, intimate relationship with Western intelligence services, he went into Syria. So the Western intelligence services, NATO intelligence services, have been infiltrating international jihadis into Syria to try and overthrow Assad. The Saudis have definitely been involved in this. The Saudis are our allies. Now, I don't think it takes much imagination to realise that we could be playing with fire here. Well, we're training people and then they come and do this stuff to us.
Well, with the CIA,
but I would suggest that it's worse than that, that it's possibly an intelligence-led operation.
Well, with the CIA torture report coming out at the end of December, end of December, I mean, that was some ramifications over several weeks, more and more revelations about what had been going on by the CIA, who are, of course, part of NATO. The French nationalist leader, Marine Le Pen, and others in French politics were saying, well, it's time to leave NATO again. That was at the end of December.
And Marine Le Pen, who may win the presidential election in France, is saying that this provocation of Russia over Ukraine is not in our interests. Now, that gives a motive for such an attack if it was orchestrated from inside NATO. The means, well, we've trained these people to go and fight in Syria, we just redirect them, and opportunity. Well, Charlie Hebdo, it's full of sort of lefty types that we're not that friendly to anyway, and by killing them, we will intimidate the left in France and force them into line. So it makes all sort. It reminds me very much of the Brabant massacres in the 1980s.
Well, that's an interesting comparison. Just over the border in Belgium,
which were gun attacks on supermarkets geared at ordinary people.
We've had a supermarket siege just today, and also in that same Brabant massacres, I think it was around 1987. There were also police shot dead in those attacks, because what happened was that special forces came in and stole guns from a police station and killed police in the process, making it look as if it was left-wing terrorists that had been doing it.
That was US Marines who did that, according to investigations that were carried out by the Observer and so on. The other possibility...
And by the Belgian government, by the way, the parliamentary inquiry.
The other possibility is that this is an Israeli hit on the French, because they've just voted to the lower house of French Parliament just voted to recognise Palestine. There are various people who have a motive. But the pattern is fairly clear, as you say. In all these countries, just as they're making crucial decisions about whether to involve themselves in the American-led coalition in Iraq and Syria, these events magically appear and scare everybody in the right direction. Now, that we don't know what's happening, but what we do know, and there is no doubt about, is that in the past, NATO intelligence services, that includes the DGSE, the French intelligence services, it includes MI6, it includes the CIA, it certainly includes Mossad, the Israeli intelligence services. They do things like
well, these Operation Gladio, the actual operations were, a lot of them planned from Switzerland, from something called the Club of Bern, the Club de Bern. Yeah. Tell us a bit about them, because they're mostly retired intelligence operatives and serving intelligence people, plus as well people who are involved with private military companies.
Yeah, well, you've got to remember that Switzerland was neutral in World War II. Now, they were surrounded on all sides by the Italians, the Germans,
and they made Austrians. Quite a lot of money out of it all.
Yes, they did. But on the other hand, in other words, they are a good place to organise. Don't forget that the Gladio structures were created by integrating former fascist intelligence officers into NATO. And Switzerland, as a neutral country during the war, was a good place for all of these things to be brought together.
Now, one of the other aspects to all of this, of course, is that these guys that allegedly carried out this attack, that were being told, or anyway, were very high up the watch list in France, and one would be, hope anyway, that it would be very difficult for them to get the sort of training necessary to carry out an attack, and also to obtain automatic weapons, ammunition, and rocket-propelled grenades.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fact is, I think the thing I would stress...
I mean, we're not hearing about heads rolling at the DCRI, which is the Internal Security Service. What we're hearing is that actually there's going to be more money for it.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? If they are carrying out these attacks, and the Russian FSB was accused of doing this when they bombed Moscow and Ryazan in 1998. They carry out the attacks. They then say, "Oh gosh, with these terrible attacks are carrying on, so we actually need more power, more resources. We're going to have to squash civil liberties in order to deal with the problem." And so it's a kind of reaction solution game that's going on. And I keep stressing, there is no doubt about it that NATO intelligence services and special forces have been training insurgents to fight in Syria.
But isn't the most likely explanation, as we've heard, apparently one of these guys shouting, was that they're people who've got links to Yemen?
Well, if you were carrying out a NATO false flag attack, that's exactly what you would expect them to do. The way this was avoided in the Irish conflict was that there were definite code words whereby the IRA would identify whether they had or hadn't carried out an attack, and then very rarely did they ever not claim an attack, even if it was a disastrous mess and lots of civilians were killed. But of course, in these kind of attacks, the purpose, if it is being carried out from inside the intelligence structure, the purpose is to bamboozle the public. So of course now it looks quite likely that these guys are dead, and therefore no tales will be told. And that's another hallmark of these kind of events. If it was an orchestra.
Well, another aspect to all of this is we've been told that there's an incredible thing about free speech in France. People should be able to do cartoons about whatever they want, say whatever they want. But actually, an 80-year-old cartoonist called Maurice Sinet in January 2009 was not only sacked from Charlie Hebdo, but he was also prosecuted for writing a column where he was talking about Jean Sarkozy, the son of the president, converting to Judaism for financial reasons. So he's not just sacked, but actually prosecuted in the criminal law for inciting hatred.
Well, I've seen the relevant cartoons which are claimed to be the source of this attack, and they are pretty distasteful. The sort of thing that, in fact, if it was against any other kind of minority, would be regarded as unacceptable. If Jews had been lampooned in that way, they would rightly be angry. But I'm actually a believer in freedom of speech. But the point is that this is all a diversion. It's quite likely that this is actually a false flag attack by NATO's Gladio structures or by the Israelis in order to achieve a political effect. And when people say, oh, you can't say things like that, that's just, yes, I can, because the documentary evidence going back decades that this is the sort of thing that goes on is overwhelming. And of course, that's what the mainstream media surely it's not. It's much more likely that these guys have just done it on their own. Possibly the intelligence services have stood back and allowed them to. Well, if that's the case, then we should ask ourselves a question. If it's terrible for people to do this in Paris, why is it okay for them to do it in Damascus? Because that's been the British and French position up to now.
OK, Martin. We're joined on the line now for our next item by Richard Peppiatt. Hi, Richard, and welcome to the Politics Show.
Thank you very much.
First of all, tell us about, because I mean, the thing is, there is in a way a kind of bizarre connection with you in this, because I know watching your film, One Rogue Reporter, that the Daily Star, who you were working for originally, actually got you to sort of dress up in a burqa to see how people would react. Just tell us a little bit about that, and also about what you experienced at the Star about attitudes to Muslims.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that anyone who's taken a casual glance at the Daily Star will know that it's not very sympathetic towards Islam, and certainly a few years ago, with the rise of the English Defence League, which at the time sort of seemed like it was really gaining momentum. I know that they're sort of an afterthought these days, but at the time the Daily Star were almost their cheerleaders, and wrote some rather glowing editorials and things about the English Defence League, and certainly, for me that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and that I didn't want to be associated with a newspaper that was going to give credence to those sort of extremist views, and I quit. And yeah, I mean, in my time at the Daily Star, I was sent out dressed in a burqa to write a piece about what it's like wearing a burqa, which to my great shame, I did, somewhat under duress, but I did do it, and yeah, it's I do think that there is an issue in the mainstream media to do with Islamophobia that exists to this day, and certainly things that have happened in the last couple of days in France, aren't going to cool off some of those tensions by any means.